Hello, everyone. Good to see many of you in the room. For the ones that you are not involved directly in the Fire Adapt projects. My name is Nuria Prat, and I'm the general coordinator of this project. We are very happy to host this webinar series. Today is the launch of this webinar series that will start from now until December 2026, the end of this year. This for FireDAP is the final year of the project. It has been running for the last 3 years. And we'll use this series of webinars to promote some of the work that has been produced as part of FireAdapt, or it has been a collaboration of it. And we are very excited about it because it will be a tool that we will all have to share and discuss novel science and findings that supports the implementation of integrated fire management practices. So just some housekeeping rules. Please mute your microphone. There will be a Q&A at the end. And you can always post in the chat if you want to, if you have any questions or you want to comment. And you can also raise your hand and speak. And then the webinar will be recorded and will be available in the social media and platforms from FireAdapt. And with that said, I give the floor to Emma Oliveras, the scientific coordinator of FireAdapt, who will explain a bit more about the project and also introduce today's speaker, Natasha. Thank you very much. Emma, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Nuria. Welcome, everyone. It's really exciting to be here in the first of the webinar series of FireAdapt. I hope you'll enjoy and follow us throughout the year. So just to put a little bit of context on what FireAdapt is, for those that are external to the project, FireAdapt is a knowledge exchange project that wants to aim to including the full diversity of fire types and different contexts by bringing together expertise from across regions, from the Mediterranean basin and Latin America with a transdisciplinary perspective. So we are together different actors, different expertise, academias, different types of academia, policymakers, stakeholders, and so on. The aim of the project is to improve the understanding of the role of integrated fire management for enhancing natural and cultural ecosystem services and for wildfire prevention. In FireAdapt, we take the concept of integrated fire management as a holistic approach to fire management, which includes the coordination of different strategies, actors, and tools to control, prevent, respond to, and recover from forest fires. We have different visions and perspectives around FAM, but we think that they are all interconnected and reflect different stakeholders' interests, environmental considerations, and cultural context. So often these perspectives have to be merged together somehow to have a really holistic approach to facing the landscape resilient, local livelihoods, ecological implications, and wildfire risk, wildfire hazard reduction for landscape management. This is an example of some of the work that we've been doing for integrated fire management. I apologize because I totally forgot to put the reference of here, but it's a paper that the FireAdapt Consortium published last year, in which we mapped the different types of perspective and objectives that integrated fire management approaches had throughout the world. And the wildfire hazard reduction is one of the predominants on the world, but we also have very widespread objectives on ecological conservation and local livelihoods, which are really, really relevant to have a balanced approach, an holistic approach on fire management. The project involves 10 countries, 24 institutions from Latin America and from Europe. And we work together through different exchanges and meetings that I'm going to briefly explain. We are organizing 5 work packages, one that looks at carbon dynamics, another that looks at biodiversity conservation. Then there is a work package on cultural services and well-being, a work package on modeling, forecasting, and a work package on integrated fire management as a climate adaptation approach. That includes also 5 study hubs that I'm going to explain in the next slide. And then we have a work package in communication and outreach with Lucia de la Riva, who is here in the audience, and a coordination work package as Nuria and other colleagues are represented. The study hubs are the meetings in which the whole consortium meets. We have done 5 so far. So we started in Spain in 2023 when we launched the project. Then we did one in Mexico, that was also joined with a TREX event. Then we did a study hub in Brazil in 2024, one in France in early 2025. Also in September, October in Argentina, and we will have our final one in Italy in this coming May, June. Then what we are going to do through these webinars is share part of the research and part of the results that we have been having associated to the Fire Adapt, not necessarily, but also maybe with work packages. We're still building up the series. So members of Fire Adapt Consortium, if you're interested in giving a presentation, contact us. So far, we have had, and we would like to highlight a lot the research that has been associated to the early career researchers that have been part of the consortium. Starting with today with Natasha Hill, but then we are going to have another series of early career researchers, and sometimes mixed with talks of more senior people or more perspectives from other expertises like practitioners. So without any further delay, I'm going to give the floor to the speaker of today, which is Natasha Hill from the University of East Anglia. Natasha is an early career researcher. She's originally from England. She completed her master degree at the University of East Anglia on climate change and global development. She started late last year, her PhD at the University of East Anglia, supervised by Rachel Carmenta, also with Martin Scott, Liana Anderson, and Arjan Bershaw. And her research is about preliminary entitled about warming the heart, in identifying how transforming tropical fire discourses can contribute towards more effective and equitable governance. The research that she's going to share with us today, it's part of her master's research as her PhD research. Her PhD has just started, and she doesn't have results to show, but hopefully she will have soon. So without any further delay, Natasha, when you want, the floor is yours.
You. Let me just share my screen really quickly. Can you guys see that okay?
Coming through, yeah. This is the presentations. You have to change.
Wait a second.
We tested this before, but it's always like that.
Yeah. Is that better?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Cool. Okay. So yeah, as Emma said, my name is Natasha Hill. I'm an early career researcher as part of the Fire Adapt network, and I'm in my first year of my PhD. So I have yet to go on my fieldwork. So I don't have any PhD research to share, But this is part of a scoping review that I did in my master's dissertation last year that we're currently working on trying to publish, which is really exciting. First off, I will give some context of the situation in Brazil, as this scoping review was based off of research on the human impacts of wildfire in the Brazilian Amazon. So globally, fire is increasing and flammability is worsening, and fires in the Brazilian Amazon are worsening as a result of the interconnection between climate change, anthropogenic influence, which relates to either anthropogenic climate change or incentives for different types of fire use, and weak governance approaches that often accumulate in zero fire approaches where local and indigenous burnings are criminalized, as fire is treated as one homogenous thing rather than recognizing all the different fire types. Local communities and indigenous peoples are disproportionately affected by flammability and by these policies as well. And however, both research on both climate and fire shows a clear reliance on natural sciences in both publishing and funding, and social sciences and interdisciplinary research is usually sidelined. Relational values are often sidelined as well in policy and academia, and economic and material dimensions of human well-being, which I will explain in a bit, tend to dominate, which has considerable implications for environmental justice. We argue with this scoping review that evidence on human sufferings from fire may be a stronger evidence base to advocate for improved fire governance. So a small background on Amazonian livelihoods. So many Amazonian livelihoods are forest dependent or forest proximate, which means they live near the forest, and many rely on fire use as part of their everyday lives. Whether that's for cultural and spiritual reasons, whether it's for land clearing or subsistence agriculture, many of them have it deeply embedded within their ways of being. Forests are also key resources and territories and are also hugely embedded in indigenous ways of well-being. And therefore they are hugely affected by fire and flammability, which takes away the forest. Fire criminalisation policies are usually therefore ineffective and inequitable, but despite this, forest research appears dominated by measurements of carbon emissions and things like biodiversity increases, rather than focusing on the human dimensions, which can relate to misunderstandings of local fire use and the zero fire approaches that I mentioned earlier. So what we tried to find out from the scoping review was, what do we know from the social science literature about the impacts of rainforest fires on human well-being in the Brazilian Amazon, and what are the remaining gaps in knowledge that can help guide further research? So the sub-questions focused on different methodologies used, which dimensions of well-being are centered in the research effort, types of fire impact, the different types of fire, what impact groups are highlighted, and stuff like that. But we conducted this review not just for the impacts of fires themselves, but also the impacts of fire-related air quality and smoke, degraded forests as a result of fire, and fire-focused interventions like the zero fire policies. So what we did was conduct a scoping review on the literature that mentioned the impacts of fire or fire policy on humans. So there was a selection process once we found all of the fire literature for the Brazilian Amazon, that used inclusion and exclusion criteria to make sure what was captured was only papers within the social sciences and interdisciplinary research that focused on human impacts of fire. And for added clarification, papers that assessed human health were classified as interdisciplinary for the purpose of this research project, as even though usually they tend to sit outside natural sciences and social sciences, they often use a combination of disciplines from both social and natural sciences, from life sciences, demography and policy, and biology. So we included those as interdisciplinary for the purposes of this study. So once the papers were selected, and of this was about 48 out of the 1,700 sample that we started with, they were coded on in vivo to categorize the findings and to find any research gaps. As this was a master's dissertation, there were a few caveats. We weren't able to assess grey literature and anything that wasn't in the English language, just due to time constraints and resource constraints. So there was some studies that were written in Portuguese that were omitted from this study. So it is likely that some of the conclusions may be different as a result of that. The findings on human well-being were coded according to the following analytical framework. So this was adapted by Carmenta et al. In 2022. And it's adapted from McGregor's very famous multi-dimensional human wellbeing framework. And it was created through a locally grounded participatory approach in Pará in Brazil. Hence, we selected this specific one for the relevance to the context of the study. This framework combines multidimensional human well-being with the IPBES, advances on relational values, which include people and nature, interactions, feelings, emotions, etc. So this study grounds itself in a view that multidimensional well-being is very important. And within this, there are 3 universal dimensions, which are shown in the row at the top. So that includes material well-being, which speaks about income, assets and housing, quality of life, which involves subjective psychological well-being, education and health, and relational, which has quite a myriad of different subdimensions like cultural, spirituality, feelings of place, nature, markets, land governance, access to education and healthcare, basic infrastructure, and employment opportunities. So in this view, we try to recognize that in order to fully understand the impacts of fire on human well-being, that academia should cover a variety of these different subdimensions. But we hypothesize that this would likely not be the case. So the first thing that we found was the diagram on the left here for the natural sciences and social sciences and interdisciplinary research. You can see that for the entire query, which was about 1,700 papers that focused on fire in the Brazilian Amazon, that the majority of that was dominated by the natural sciences. Many studies were focused on biodiversity or specific ant species or something like that, and only a very small amount were social sciences and interdisciplinary. There was then the distribution of methods for the human research. So this was the 48 papers that were included in the main review. And you can see that most of this were quantitative, very little were qualitative, and a few were mixed methods. And then the diagram on the right at the bottom kind of shows, it looks a bit weird because there's one kind of inside the other, but it shows sort of the comparison between the different methods in comparison to the whole of the natural sciences and the whole research base. So having natural sciences and quantitative methods dominate has some repercussions. So this is very similar to lots of findings in wider environmental literature, where there's a clear underrepresentation of social sciences and qualitative methods. And this can result in loss of nuances, loss of locally relevant and rich insights that would likely be captured through more qualitative methodologies that are usually associated with the social sciences. The second finding was that most of the research was focused on burdens over benefits of fire. But the benefits of fire are what drive the return of fires. So a lack of data and research on the incentives makes it much more difficult to design effective interventions and fire governance, which likely results in similar criminalization policies. The third finding was that there was an overwhelming focus on the burdens of fire on quality of life. So this diagram on the right is what we call the systematic map. And it shows the different research distribution and very clearly where the gaps are and where most of the research was. And that's color-coded in different tens of papers at the bottom. So you can see that 33 papers focus specifically on the impact of air quality and smoke on quality of life. And this is also seen in the word cloud here that kind of lists all the different words that were found the most common across the 48 articles. And you can see a lot of them are very health-based, like respiratory, mortality, PM2, hospital admissions, and the ones that relate to different impacts are much, much more peripheral, stuff like government, prevention, drought, agriculture, and deforestation. So going deeper into the burdens, we created a similar table that also has the subdimensions on it. And you can see that the research was heavily dominated by the negative impacts of air quality and smoke on health, and the other dimensions of quality of life were very rarely studied. So this shows that the evidence base on the burdens of fire is very well established, with a lot of studies kind of supporting each other's conclusions, but only 3 of those studies considered the actual lived experience of these health burdens. So all these rich accounts are eclipsed by the dominance of the desk-based research, and a lot of it was quantitative and used proxies such as human lung cells or hospital admissions to make claims about health impacts of fire. We also were quite shocked by the stark gap in psychological and educational impacts, as these are much more prevalent in more Western research contexts. For example, in the US and Canada, there is a lot of research on these two factors, which does represent a justice issue that is absent from the Brazilian case. There's also a huge absence of relational impacts, which is hugely problematic as relational values are very important to the well-being of both local and Indigenous peoples. In terms of benefits, it's much more evenly distributed, but as you can see, there is a lot of research gaps. So all of the zeros represent where there was absolutely no research that focused on those subdimensions. And while the presence of benefits does contradict some claims in the literature, that when relational values are present in research, they tend to focus on pro-environmental behaviour. So here we can see that there's articles that mention the benefits of fire, something which can sometimes be considered as unsustainable, as something that is key for people's relational, economic and material well-being. So it is a step in the right direction that there are some studies on the benefits of fire, but there needs to be a lot more in order to drive more effective fire policy. So the next two findings are more related to the different impact groups that we found in the research effort and the scale at which the papers operated and the different settlement types. And the key things to pick out here are that majority of the research focused specifically on hospital patients, and that was 27% of the research effort. And that is likely because a lot of the studies were based on health and health impacts, but it means that the lived experience of those without healthcare access, which is a lot of people in rural communities in Brazil, is rendered completely invisible, as data on their hospital admissions and different illnesses are completely absent from the research base. There's also only 21% of the research that focuses on Indigenous peoples and local communities, which is a pitifully small contribution given the rising gravity of fire for local and marginalised communities who contribute the least to climate change, are often forest dependent, and suffer a disproportionate amount of burdens from both fire and fire policy. We also found an invisibility of many different stakeholder groups, such as capitalised farmers, loggers and labourers, which restricts the understanding of impacts across all different stakeholder groups, which is very important in order to drive more effective fire governance. So what we did to kind of go a bit further into the sort of what we found in the papers is we developed an idealised knowledge base through that was developed amongst the co-authors for the paper that's upcoming. And we tried to map what we did find onto this idealized knowledge base that was built on global fire literature and co-author experience in the field. Sadly, these were a bit too detailed to fit onto a PowerPoint slide. So this is kind of a smaller function of just exactly what we found in the literature. But if you are interested in seeing those full figures, please do contact me and I'm happy to share them with you. But for the material dimension of well-being, we kind of wrote down all the different impacts that were explicitly said in the papers and of what percentage they featured in the research effort. So for material benefits, they were much less prevalent than we expected as a result of global fire literature, because often material benefits really dominated the research effort in other countries. And the main focus within the research for this domain was the economic burdens of fire on GDP loss and costs of the health sector, which is represented by the slightly darker red colour for those two. But that obviously operates at a national scale, and all the more local scale impacts such as loss and threat to property, household loss of crops and poor hunting were much less prevalent and then featured in less than 5% of the research effort, which to put into context is about between 1 and 2 papers. So it really goes to show that a lot of them are very absent. And there's a lot of different research gaps in this area. For quality of life, immediately it's quite obvious that the distribution of the research effort is much more uneven, with a lot of different shades of green, which represent different amounts of percentages in the research effort that these impacts featured in. So 40% of the research effort focused specifically on the impacts on the burdens of air quality on respiratory illness incidents. Increased hospitalizations and mortality were featured in between 15 to 30% of the research effort. And subjective and educational impacts, even when they were present in less than 5% of the research effort. So again, in between about 1 to 2 papers. And lastly, for relational well-being, we can see that the distribution is much more even, but it means that every single impact that was found was in less than 5% of the research effort, which is very concerning. And most of this came from maybe 1 or 2 papers that were very qualitative focused. Yeah, so that is not great. And then the last finding was that most research doesn't clarify the exact fire type in focus. So we took fire types from Barlow's paper, which is called Clarifying Amazonia's Burning Crisis. And it's a really interesting paper that kind of splits the different fires in the Amazon into 6 different types. So that's repeated uncontrolled fires in forests, uncontrolled fire on open lands, uncontrolled fires in forest, farm fallow agriculture, deforestation fire, and pasture maintenance. And we found that most of the research was completely unclear about what type of fire it was studying, and mostly just mentioned fire or wildfire. Some did specify between accidental, malevolent, or intentional fire, but very rarely did papers specifically mention what type of fire they were interested in. So in terms of conclusions from the scoping review, we found that 89% of research on forest fire in Brazil was based in the natural sciences, which can result in a loss of nuance and locally grounded studies. 67% of social science research on burdens was focused on burdens of air quality and smoke on health. Invisibility of many expected impacts occurred, such as psychological and educational impacts, which are really common in more Western contexts, such as the US, Canada, and Australia. And all in all, there was a failure to cover the full extent of social impacts on multiple dimensions of well-being. And the most vulnerable groups were the least visible in the research. So the experience of these communities lack recognition, and procedures to assess fire impacts at this stage are often unrepresentative. And the invisibility of fire types has huge complications for policymaking, as if we cannot understand the drivers and impacts of each fire type, we often result in those zero fire policies that are usually ineffective in this region. So just in terms of my next steps, we found through this study that the lived experience of local communities appears relatively invisible in academia. So my PhD program aims to extend this research onto media coverage to see what the dominant discourses are around fire in Brazil, and then to qualitatively assess the lived experience of some communities in the Amazon to uncover their alternative discourses, and then to test which types of evidence garner different responses from stakeholders and or the public in Brazil, and do that through a choice experiment design. But yes, thank you so much for listening. My contact details are on there if you have any other questions. But other than that, yeah, I'm ready for any questions.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Natasha. That was a fascinating talk. Do we have any questions? Please feel free to raise your hand if you want. Yeah, if you want to stop sharing, maybe if people want or just share, but we can see. Laurent.
Yes, I'm turning my video on. Okay. Yep. Hi, Natasha. Thank you for the talk. I have maybe like just basic questions, but just to feed the discussion. Do you have any idea if they? You talked about the focus, main focus on health. I think there's the same problem maybe regarding the impact on lives and human infrastructures. So is it related to the fact that these things are costly for the society compared to well-being and psychology and so on? Or I don't know, it's just a question coming to my mind that we focus on what is costly in terms of euro, dollars, whatever, and we give up sometimes some non-costly things. Do you think do you think I'm wrong, or is it something you try and search for?
I think, yeah, if I've understood your question correctly, I think that's definitely something that we found was that a lot of the focus on even in the health sector, there was a lot on kind of how much it would cost the government if these fires continued and how costs to the health sector or how much USD the different hospital admission rates would create from these rising flammability issues. So a lot of it does seem to be related to how much things cost society, especially with the material well-being. The focus was specifically on GDP and on costs to different sectors, like the timber sector and the health sector. So I think definitely it's likely that that is driven by that. That makes sense.
That was my question. If you try to think about this, or like why we don't have so much studies on the psychological impact or well-being, as you say. Maybe I'm wondering if it's just because it's considered as not costly. That's it. That could be interesting for the society, but it doesn't cost money, so well, we don't care somehow. I was wondering if that was one of the reasons.
I think it also goes back to how different groups of people value nature and how people value the forests. For example, a lot of policymakers and some people in academia as well might see the forest as kind of an income generating opportunity and also a costly one if it falls away. And that is why a lot of the sort of narratives are based around carbon and like the loss of that and how that impacts people who are in high up positions, whereas a lot of the time the other ones kind of go invisible. So yeah, I do think that is a very common thing is that it's based on the costs and who impacts from it. And also in the funding of the research as well. It's something I wish we had time to look into properly. But there's a lot of literature out there that speaks about the different funding between natural and social sciences, and that policymakers often tend to only really refer to things that have big statistics and things that are really obvious to show, whereas the more qualitative accounts of people's human well-being are often not recognized by policymakers as they often don't have a lot of time or it's not presented in a really neat graph. So I think that definitely contributes to it as well.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Nuria.
Thanks, Natasha. That was a very, very interesting analysis. I was wondering while you were showing your slides, if other regions could show a similar picture. If you had the chance to look at materials from other places, or if how much of this do you think is specific for the Amazon?
I think I haven't had a chance to look myself, but one of my colleagues at UEA is doing a very similar study at the moment for Indonesia. And we are yet to completely compare our results, but we have started to compare them, and it does seem like it's a very similar picture. Although for me, health was far more prevalent than it was for her. And then someone else we know is doing one for Peru at the moment, so not sure on the comparison as of yet, but I reckon it's likely a sort of distinction between the very Western regions such as US, Canada, and Australia that have a lot of research already, and other areas which perhaps show similar findings. But that would be really interesting if we could ever get a huge distribution of different countries to see what fire research looks like at all levels and in all languages as well. I think that would be really great.
Thank you. Actually, my question built up on Nuri. It's very similar. I was curious to know if you had looked across actually other maybe fire-prone regions in Latin America, so like the Cerrado or the Pampas, because I wonder if there is this perception that because it is a fire-sensitive ecosystem, traditional indigenous communities living there is no fire or something like that. And whether are you aware of similar research in other areas, fire-prone areas, and what if there is more focus and more social sciences, or would you expect that the proportions are so similar and disproportionate as well?
I'm not too sure actually. I know that there's a lot of research on the Cerrado specifically. And I do wonder whether it's a distinction between places that are fire resistant and fire prone and the places that are fire adapted, and whether there's different research on that. I think that would be really interesting to look into. But sadly, I am not 100% aware of how it's going in different biomes.
Yeah. Especially regarding the benefits, I think there is this even wrong perception that I mean, because of Amazon is a fire sensitive, it's like, well, anything that is in Amazon is not going to be a benefit, right? Because there is this preconceived notion that it's going to be a bad outcome. So I wonder if there is some sort of a more positive arrangements elsewhere. Maybe that's something worth exploring in when you prepare your paper, because it's really fascinating. I mean, I hope you are preparing this to publish, because I think it's really relevant. And
we're trying to at the moment, but we'll see.
Yeah, maybe complement it a little bit, Liana, or some of the Brazilian colleagues can help you complement it with what it is at the Brazilian level, at least, because certainly there's local funding. I wonder if we included any. Have you made progress on that? If we included funding from Brazil, if there is a little bit of more funding going into this sort of social research or not? Do you know?
I don't know, but it seems like there's usually a pattern that the funding tends to not be on the social research. But there is some, but not a whole lot in comparison, I think, is the biggest thing. Yeah.
Do we have any more comments or questions for Natasha? Okay. Well, if not, Natasha, thank you very much for just a fascinating presentation. It's really fascinating research, and good luck with the next steps. It's really look forward to seeing how it develops and how also grows, and hopefully you put also kind of a highlight and foster a higher visibility on the social sciences for such a needed research.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Nuria, do you want to say anything?
No, just reiterate, Emma, what you just said. So thank you so much, and looking forward also to hear more about your research, and the upcoming webinars will also show some interesting research. So really looking forward to them and to building also synergies between the different people participating. Thank you very much.